He lived in a place that no one wanted to climb, and when he finally found someone willing to stay, he discovered that the right heart turns even the loneliest crag into a home. Can you imagine living so isolated that needing a loaf of bread means trekking down an entire mountain? So suspended between heaven and earth that the wind never stops howling at your windows. This story took place in the rugged backcountry of the Appalachian Mountains in March of 1927, a place where few dared to tread and even fewer managed to call home. Before we go on, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. It really helps the channel grow and keeps me motivated to bring you more moving stories like this one. And if you love true stories of resilience and real love, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Now stay with me because this story will touch your heart from beginning to end. Henry Miller was 32 years old and lived alone in a house that felt more like a sentence than an inheritance. The stone structure sat atop a rocky ridge, surrounded by granite formations that rose from the earth like giant fingers pointing toward the sky. To get there, you had to climb a narrow trail that snaked between boulders, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. It was a 40-minute climb for those who knew the way, and well over an hour for those making the trek for the first time with their hearts in their throats and their legs shaking. The house itself was simple, built from the same grey stones as the ridge, with a roof of weathered cedar shingles that the wind would try to tear off every winter. It had only 3 rooms, a main cabin that served as the kitchen and living area, a small bedroom with an iron bedstead and an old trunk, and a pantry where Henry kept his tools, sacks of flour, and the meagre remains of his harvests. The windows were narrow, with heavy wooden shutters that groaned all night long when the wind blew hard, and the floor consisted of wide planks that creaked under every step. But outside was where the place revealed its secret. At the top of the ridge, beyond the house, lay nearly 5 acres of flat, fertile land, shielded from the wind by the rock formations that circled the property like natural ramparts. A spring bubbled up between the stones in the north corner, forming a thin creek that ran through the rocks before tumbling down into the valley in a hidden waterfall. And the view, good Lord, the view would take anyone's breath away. You could see the entire valley stretching out green and rolling as far as the eye could reach, with the village of Stone Creek looking like a miniature nativity scene far below. And on clear days, the bluish mountains on the horizon blurred right into the sky. Henry had inherited the place from his uncle Silas, an eccentric man who had been a land surveyor for a timber tycoon decades ago, and chose to build his home in the most inaccessible spot he could find. He liked the solitude, he'd say. He liked being above the world and its petty grievances. When Silas passed away 7 years earlier, he left the property to Henry with a simple note: "To the only nephew who visited me without expecting anything in return. Take good care of our piece of heaven." At the time, Henry was 25 and lived in the village, taking care of his widowed mother who was sickly. He thought about selling the impossible inheritance, but no one offered even half of what it was worth. "Who wants to buy a house you need a mountain goat to reach?" they'd mock in the village with a laugh. So he tucked the deed away and kept his life on solid ground, working as a carpenter's apprentice and tending to his mother as she slowly faded away. Mrs. Martha Miller was a woman of grit, but the consumption in her lungs had no respect for strength of character. She spent 4 years coughing blood, losing weight, flickering out like a candle at the end of its wick. Henry cared for her with a devotion that was painful to witness. He prepared the herbal teas the local doctor prescribed, sat by her bed, reading the newspaper aloud, even when he knew she no longer understood the words, and held her bony hand in the small hours of the morning when the coughing fits were at their worst. The young women in town, who might have been interested in him, eventually married other men, while Henry spent his days between work and caregiving, with no time for courting or barn dances. When Martha finally found rest on a cold morning in June 1926, Henry was 31 and completely alone in the world. He had no siblings. His father had died when he was just a boy, and his cousins had all migrated to the big cities in search of a better life. He buried his mother in the churchyard, sold the modest cottage they lived in to pay off the medical debts, and stared at the deed to Uncle Silas's house like a man looking at his last remaining option. It was a day in August, with the winter chill already biting at the bones, when Henry climbed the trail up the ridge, carrying his few belongings in a canvas bedroll. The climb was harder than he remembered. The brush had overtaken parts of the path, and loose stones made some passages treacherous. When he reached the top with his chest burning and his legs trembling, he found the house exactly as his uncle had left it, abandoned for 7 years, with cobwebs in the corners, bird nests under the eaves, and a thick layer of dust coating everything. But the structure was sound. The stone walls hadn't cracked, the roof had only lost a few shingles, and the spring was still bubbling crystal clear among the rocks. Henry spent 3 weeks cleaning, repairing, and making the place livable. He planted beans, corn, and squash in the good earth. He discovered that up there the climate was different, cooler, and certain plants grew better than in the valley. He grew used to trekking up and down the trail, carrying baskets of produce to sell at the market, to sleeping in a vast silence broken only by the wind and the crickets, and to waking up with the sun rising red over the distant peaks. But the loneliness weighed heavy. Henry wasn't a man of many words, never had been, but he wasn't meant to live like a wild animal in the woods. He missed preparing food for someone other than himself, missed having someone to share the awe of a sunset that was almost too beautiful to bear, missed hearing a human voice that wasn't his own, echoing off the stone walls. He began heading down to the village more often, not just to sell his crops, but to feel like a part of humanity again. It was during one of those trips down, in February of 1927, that he bumped into Mrs. Abigail Higgins at the church doors. Mrs. Higgins was known throughout Stone Creek as the best matchmaker in the county. She had a clinical eye for pairing people up, they said, and indeed she had joined at least 15 couples who were still happily married years later. She was a woman in her 60s, a widow, stout, with a quick smile and a sharper tongue. "Henry, my boy, you look like a man who's in dire need of company," she said bluntly after they exchanged greetings. "Have you thought about finding yourself a wife?" Henry felt his face flush. "I think about it every day, Mrs. Higgins," he admitted, "but who's going to want a man who lives where I live?" Mrs. Higgins narrowed her eyes with interest. "And where exactly do you live? I heard you inherited that crazy house of your Uncle Silas's." Henry confirmed that he had, and explained he'd been living there for months. Mrs. Higgins stayed silent for a moment, evaluating him. Then she said she knew a few young women from good families who were of a marrying age and hadn't found husbands yet. They weren't the prettiest or the wealthiest, she explained frankly, but they were hard-working and had good hearts. Would Henry like her to introduce some candidates? Henry's heart skipped a beat. "I would, yes," he replied, trying not to sound too desperate. "But they need to know where I live. I don't want to mislead anyone." Mrs. Higgins waved her hand, dismissing his concern. "The right girl won't mind, son. It's the man that matters, not the house." She set a date for the following Saturday. She said she would bring the first candidate to meet Henry and see the property. Henry spent the entire week tidying the house like he never had before. He swept 3 times, scrubbed the floor until the planks shone, washed the curtains his uncle had left behind that had turned yellow with time, pulled the weeds around the house, and even tried to fix the window shutters that creaked too much. He planted wild flowers in a wooden crate near the door. He wanted the place to look welcoming, not just isolated and severe. On Saturday, he went down the trail early in the morning and waited at the foot of the ridge, as agreed. Mrs. Higgins arrived around noon, bringing a girl named Jane. She was about 28, thin, with a long face, and kept her eyes on the ground the whole time. "She works as a maid for a family in town," Mrs. Higgins explained. "But she wants to marry and have a life of her own." Henry greeted Jane kindly, noticing she barely looked up. He explained that the house was at the top and that they would need to climb the trail. Jane nodded, and they began the ascent with him in front, Jane in the middle, and Mrs. Higgins behind, huffing with the effort. 15 minutes later, when the trail narrowed between the rocks with the drop-off appearing to the right, Jane stopped walking. Henry looked back and saw she was pale, her hands gripping a rock beside her. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm terrified of heights. I can't go any further." Mrs. Higgins tried to encourage her, saying it wasn't much further and that it was safe, but Jane began to tremble and said she was going to fall, that she couldn't breathe right. Henry went down to where she was and offered help, but Jane was already stumbling back down the stones, with her eyes wide with panic. Mrs. Higgins looked at Henry with an expression that said, "Well, that one didn't work out." The three of them went back down in silence. At the bottom, Jane barely said goodbye before almost running back toward the village. Mrs. Higgins patted Henry's shoulder and told him not to lose heart, that she had other candidates. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Higgins appeared with Margaret, a 30-year-old woman who had worked in the fields her whole life, and, according to the matchmaker, wasn't afraid of anything. Indeed, Margaret climbed the trail without a single complaint, reached the top without even being out of breath, and looked at the stone house with a neutral expression. Henry showed her the property with a sense of pride, the planted land, the spring, the spectacular view. Margaret listened to it all, walked around, went into the house and came out quickly. Then she looked at Henry and asked directly, "How many times a week do you go down to the village?" Henry explained he went down 2 or 3 times, depending on what was needed. Margaret crossed her arms. "And if I get sick, if I need help, there are no neighbors here, no one nearby. If something happens, I'll die before I can get help." Henry tried to explain that he would always be around, that he would take care of her, but Margaret shook her head. "No, mister. Sorry, but it won't work. This is too far from everything. It feels more like a prison than a home." She walked back down the trail without looking back. The third candidate was Sarah, a young woman of 23, the daughter of a washerwoman. Mrs. Higgins had warned him she was very shy but had a good heart. Sarah climbed the trail with difficulty, but made it to the top. When she saw the house, however, her face fell. "It's so small," she said softly to Mrs. Higgins, but loud enough for Henry to hear. "I thought it would be bigger, and so far from everything. How will I visit my mother every week living up here?" Mrs. Higgins tried to argue that the girl could go down whenever she wanted, but Sarah was already shaking her head. "My mother is alone and needs me. I can't live in a place that takes almost an hour just to get to town. Sorry, Mr. Miller, but it's not for me." There were 5 candidates in total. The 4th didn't even make it to the top. She gave up halfway up the trail, saying it was no place for humans, only for mountain goats. The 5th made it up, saw the house, and commented loudly that she had imagined something better, that a man living in such a strange place should at least have a large house to make up for it. After the 5th rejection, Henry thanked Mrs. Higgins, but asked her not to bring anyone else. "I don't want to go through this humiliation again," he said in a weary voice. "I think I'll just stay alone. This place isn't for everyone, I understand that." Mrs. Higgins stayed silent on the way back, but Henry noticed she seemed troubled. She was a stubborn woman who didn't accept defeat easily, but even she seemed to have realized that this case was too difficult. Henry returned to his house on the ridge, and tried to convince himself he didn't need company, that he was fine alone, that he had the land, the sky, and his freedom. But the nights grew longer, the silence heavier, and he caught himself talking to himself just to hear a human voice break the solitude of the stones. It was on a March afternoon, nearly a month after the last rejection, that Henry went down to the village market to sell his vegetables. He was arranging the baskets at his stall when he heard a woman's voice behind him asking the price of the squash. He turned around and saw a woman he didn't know. She was about 27, thin, of average height, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wasn't beautiful in a way that would stop people in the street, but she had an interesting face, dark and intelligent eyes, and the air of someone who was used to hard work. Henry told her the price, and she haggled skillfully, managing to knock off 2 cents. He accepted with a smile. He liked her wit. While he wrapped the squash in newspaper, he asked if she was new to the village. The woman explained no, she'd lived there her whole life, but had spent the last few months caring for her sick father, who lived on a remote farm and had died 3 weeks ago. Henry offered his condolences, and she thanked him with a nod. "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Evans. My father was Jack Evans, the one who owned the general store on Main Street. I don't know if you knew him." Henry said he knew the name and was sorry for her loss. Clara smiled sadly and explained she was now staying as a guest at a cousin's house while she decided what to do with her life. Her father had left debts, the store had been foreclosed on, and there was almost nothing left. She was a seamstress and was looking for work. They talked for a few more minutes. Henry discovered Clara had a dry sense of humor that made him laugh, that she read the papers and had opinions on politics, and that she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. When she left carrying her squash, Henry watched her walk away down the dirt street and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine interest. The next day, Henry was climbing the trail carrying a sack of flour when he found Mrs. Higgins waiting at the foot of the ridge. She had an excited expression that made him suspicious. "Henry, my boy," she said without preamble, "I've found the perfect girl for you." Henry sighed. "Mrs. Higgins, I already said I don't want to go through that anymore." "But this one is different," the matchmaker insisted. "Her name is Clara Evans, the late Jack's daughter. She was left with nothing after her father died. She needs a home, and most importantly, she's not like those other fussy little girls. Clara is a woman of grit, a hard worker, and she's not afraid of a struggle." Henry's heart raced at the name. "Is she the girl who bought a squash from me yesterday at the market?" Mrs. Higgins confirmed, surprised. "You already met her? Then you know she's a girl of quality. Henry, I spoke to her about you, explained your situation, and do you know what she said? She said she'd like to see the place before deciding anything. She didn't refuse outright like the others. She agreed to climb up and see it with her own eyes." Henry felt hope and fear mixing in his chest. "And if she climbs up and refuses too, I don't know if I can take another one." Mrs. Higgins put her hand on his arm. "Henry, my boy, I've married off a lot of people in my life. I've developed an eye for these things, and I'm telling you, Clara is different. She's not looking for a rich husband or a fancy house. She's looking for dignity and a place to start over. Give it a chance. If she refuses, I promise I won't bring anyone else." Henry finally agreed. They set a date for the following Saturday, at the same time as before, but this time Henry didn't clean the house with desperation or try to hide the simplicity of the place. If Clara was going to refuse, let her refuse seeing the truth, not a decorated version he wouldn't be able to maintain. Saturday dawned with a clear sky and a cool breeze. Henry went down the trail and found Mrs. Higgins and Clara waiting. Clara was wearing a simple blue cotton dress, her hair pinned up, and she carried a canvas bag over her shoulder. When she saw Henry, she smiled slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. Mrs. Higgins told me about where you live. I was curious. Henry greeted them both and explained the climb was difficult, that it would take at least 40 minutes, and that the trail got narrow in some parts. Clara looked at the ridge rising above them and said simply, "Then let's get going before the sun gets too hot." They began to climb. Henry went in front, clearing the way. Clara came right behind him, and Mrs. Higgins brought up the rear, huffing. For the first 15 minutes the trail was wide and relatively easy. Clara climbed with a steady pace, didn't complain, and just observed everything carefully. Henry explained the landmarks along the way. This mushroom-shaped rock, that crooked tree, the place where the spring bubbled up through the moss before disappearing again into the rocks. When they reached the narrow stretch, where the drop-off appeared on the right and the stone wall on the left, Henry stopped and warned her, "This is the hardest part. Don't look down if you're afraid of heights. If you need to, you can hold my hand." Clara stepped close to the edge and looked out over the valley below. Henry waited for her to scream or pull back, but Clara just stood there, the wind ruffling the strands of hair escaping her bun, her eyes fixed on the landscape stretching out dizzyingly. "What a beautiful view," she said finally. "You can see the whole world from here." Mrs. Higgins arrived out of breath and grabbed Clara's arm. "Careful, girl. It's dangerous to be near the edge." But Clara didn't seem scared. She seemed fascinated. She passed through the narrow stretch carefully but without fear, and when she reached the other side, she turned to look back at the path they'd taken with an expression of satisfaction. Henry felt something stir in his chest. She really was different. The climb continued. Clara only paused once to drink water from a canteen she'd brought, and then kept going steadily. Mrs. Higgins was clearly regretting having made the climb, but Clara seemed to be enjoying the challenge. She asked how long it took Henry to climb up alone, if he'd ever had an accident, if wild animals ever appeared on the trail. Henry answered as they climbed, surprised by her genuine interest. 40 minutes if I'm not carrying a heavy load," he explained. "I've slipped twice, but never got seriously hurt. And yes, sometimes I see deer, raccoons, once even a cougar passed by in the distance, but they won't attack if you don't provoke them." Clara absorbed every piece of information like someone studying new terrain. When they finally reached the top, she stopped at the last natural stone step and stood looking. The stone house was ahead, solid and simple against the blue sky. On either side, the rock formations rose protectively. And beyond, the flat, fertile land stretched out green, the spring sparkled in the sun, and the view of the valley was breathtaking. Mrs. Higgins let herself drop onto a rock to rest. Clara took a few steps forward, slowly, looking at everything. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Henry stood still, holding his breath, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Clara turned to him. "Can I see the inside of the house?" Henry nodded and led her to the door. He opened it and let her in first. Clara entered slowly, her eyes sweeping over the simple room, the wood-burning stove in the corner, the rustic wooden table, the 2 chairs, the shelf with pots and plates, and the narrow window where golden light streamed in. She moved to the bedroom, saw the iron bed, the trunk, and the other window with a view of the rocks. She went into the pantry, noticing the sacks of flour, the organized tools, the empty baskets. She came back to the main room without saying a word. Henry was tense. Mrs. Higgins had entered as well and was watching Clara closely. Clara went to the window and stood looking out at the vast green and blue expanse that stretched to the horizon. The wind came through the open window, bringing the scent of the woods and freedom. "It's very isolated," Clara said finally. Henry felt his heart sink. Here was the polite refusal. But Clara continued, "Far from everything, hard to reach, a simple house, a hard life." She turned to face him. "But it's honest. It's real. There are no lies in this place." Henry didn't know what to say. Clara looked around once more and then said something he would never forget. "I've lived in the village my whole life, always surrounded by people, always depending on the goodwill of others. I lost my father, I lost my home. I was left with nothing and had to sleep in the corner of a cousin's living room who barely wants me there. This place might be isolated, but it's not humiliating. It's hard, but it's not a prison. And the view, good Lord, the view makes me feel like I can breathe for the first time in months." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Mrs. Higgins looked from Clara to Henry with a smile forming on her face. Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you saying you accept?" he asked in a husky voice. Clara took a deep breath. "I'm saying I want to try. If you'll have me, of course. I'm not a girl from a wealthy family. I don't know if I'm what you're looking for. But I'm a hard worker. I know how to sew, cook, and tend a garden, and I'm not afraid of heights or solitude. What I'm afraid of is living without dignity." Henry's eyes burned. "You are exactly what I'm looking for," he said, his voice more emotional than he intended. "Someone who sees this place the way I do, not as a punishment, but as a possibility." Mrs. Higgins clapped her hands once, satisfied. "Then it's decided. I'll arrange the marriage papers. When do you want to get married?" Clara and Henry looked at each other. It was the first time their eyes truly met, without haste, without fear. And in that moment, atop that impossible ridge, with the wind blowing and the world stretching out at their feet, something was born that neither of them expected, the fragile, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they thought. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the main church in Stone Creek. Clara wore a white dress she had sewn herself, working through the night, a simple fabric but with an impeccable cut that showed her skill with a needle and thread. Henry had borrowed a suit from Mr. Bennett, the general store owner, and was uncomfortable with the tight collar but happy in a way he couldn't hide. Mrs. Higgins cried through the entire ceremony, as proud as if she had made the match of the century. Only 10 people attended. Clara's cousin, who seemed relieved to be rid of the unwelcome guest, 2 of Henry's neighbors from when he lived with his mother, the preacher, Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Bennett and his wife, and 2 curious onlookers who slipped into the church just to see the wedding of the man from the ridge and the girl who agreed to climb it. After the ceremony, there was no reception. Clara had no family to host, Henry had no money for a banquet, and both preferred it that way. No fuss. Mrs. Higgins insisted on serving a simple lunch at her house: stewed chicken, rice, beans, cornbread, and a cornmeal cake she had baked herself. They all ate together, spoke little, and as the sun began to dip, Henry looked at Clara and said softly, "It's time to head up before it gets dark." Clara agreed, thanked Mrs. Higgins for the lunch and all her help, and picked up the bundle of her belongings, nothing more than 3 changes of clothes, her sewing kit, a shawl that had belonged to her mother, and an old Bible. Henry carried another bundle with the supplies they had bought in town: flour, salt, cheese, molasses, and candles. The climb was silent. The marriage had made everything official, real and frightening. Now they were husband and wife. They were going to share a home, a bed, a life. They barely knew each other. Henry led the way with his bundle on his back. Clara followed with hers, and both seemed lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the top, the sun was already setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky orange, pink, and purple. Clara stopped at the last stone step and stood watching the spectacle of colors pouring over the valley. Henry stood beside her, watching too. They stood there side by side, 2 strangers married only hours ago, sharing a silence that was almost comfortable. "Is it like this every day?" Clara asked softly. "When there are no clouds, yes," Henry replied. "Sometimes even more beautiful." Clara smiled slightly. Then the climb was worth it for this alone. Henry felt a warmth in his chest at the remark. He took the bundles inside the house, while Clara stayed a moment longer looking at the sky. When she came in, he had already lit the kerosene lamp and was putting wood in the stove. "I'll make some coffee," he said awkwardly. "You must be tired from the climb." Clara placed her bundle in the corner. "Let me do it. You climbed up carrying weight too." They stood looking at each other, neither of them quite knowing how to act. Finally, Henry said, "We can do it together. You make the coffee, and I'll heat up some water for you to wash your face if you like." Clara agreed, and so they began their first night as husband and wife, sharing small tasks, learning to occupy the same space. Henry showed her where he kept everything. Clara reorganized some pots in a way that made more sense to her. And he didn't complain. They drank coffee with bread Mrs. Higgins had sent, ate cheese and molasses, and talked about practical small things. The spring, what time he woke up, what he planted, when he went down to the market. When it came time to sleep, the awkwardness returned. Henry offered the bed to Clara and said he would sleep in the main room. Clara shook her head. "We're married, Henry. You don't need to sleep on the floor because of me. The bed is big enough for two." So they slept in the same bed for the first time, each clinging to their own edge, a respectful distance between their bodies, listening to each other's breathing in the dark. The wind howled low at the windows, and far off an owl hooted. Henry stayed awake for a long time, aware of Clara's presence beside him, the heat radiating from her, the soft sound of her breath. Finally, he fell asleep and dreamed of good things for the first time in years. Clara woke when the first ray of sunlight came through the narrow window. Henry had already gotten up. She heard noise in the main room and the smell of fresh coffee. She got up, fixed her hair, washed her face in the basin he had left ready, and walked out of the bedroom. Henry was putting bread on the griddle. "Good morning," he said without looking at her, clearly shy. "I made fresh coffee." Clara thanked him and sat at the table. They ate breakfast in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people still learning how to speak to one another. Afterward, Henry said he needed to work in the garden, pulling weeds, watering some plants. Clara asked if she could help. He seemed surprised, but agreed. They went out to the planted area together. The morning sun was golden and cool, the wind calmer than at night. Henry showed her what needed to be done, and Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She didn't know much about farming, but she had skillful hands and learned quickly. Henry corrected her when necessary, teaching her the right way to pull weeds without damaging the good plants, how to feel the soil to know if it needed water. They worked all morning side by side. Clara was sweating, her dress was soiled with dirt, but she didn't complain once. When they stopped to rest around noon, her face was flushed from the sun and effort, strands of hair stuck to her forehead, but she was smiling. "I like working with my hands," she said. "It's different from sewing, but it's good just the same." Henry looked at her with something new in his chest, admiration perhaps. "You really are different from the others," he said without thinking. Clara looked at him. "The others who climbed up and refused?" Henry nodded, embarrassed to have mentioned it. Clara was silent for a moment. Then she said, "They weren't wrong, Henry. This place isn't for everyone. It's isolated, it's hard, it requires strength." They were honest in refusing. "I only accepted because I had nothing to lose, and because, strangely, I felt at home here the first time I climbed up." Henry looked at her with enormous gratitude. "And are you feeling at home now?" Clara looked around, at the rocks, the earth, the vast sky. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "But I want to find out." The first days turned into the first week. Clara woke up early, helped Henry in the garden, then went back to the house and sewed while he kept working. She had brought her sewing supplies and started making improvements to their clothes. She mended Henry's work shirts, adjusted her own dress which had been too loose, and sewed new curtains for the windows using scraps she had saved. Henry noticed every small change. The house was starting to feel different, more welcoming. The new curtains let light in, but protected them from the cold night wind. Clara had put wild flowers in a clay pot on the table. She had reorganized the pantry in a way that made more sense, and she cooked well, better than he did, seasoning the food with herbs she gathered near the spring. At night, after dinner, they sat on the porch Henry had built at the front of the house. There, with the world stretching out dark below and the stars shining above, they talked. Clara told him about her life with her father, about how she had learned to sew from her mother, who died when she was a girl, about the books she had borrowed from the church library. Henry told her about Uncle Silas, about caring for his mother, about the years of solitude on that ridge. "If you like to read, I can bring books from the village," Henry offered. "There's a small library at the parsonage. The preacher lets people borrow them." Clara smiled gratefully. "I'd love that. It's been a long time since I read anything new. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this story." In the second week, Henry went down to the market, taking Clara along for the first time as his wife. The descent was easier than the climb, but it still took time. At the market, people looked at Clara with ill-disguised curiosity. "The girl who accepted the ridge," they whispered, "the one who wasn't afraid to climb." Clara ignored the stares and helped Henry sell the produce. She had a way with words, talking to the customers, haggling skillfully, and by the end of the market, they had sold more than Henry usually did alone. On the way back, he commented on this, and Clara shrugged. "Women buying from women always buy more," she explained. "They trust more." Henry laughed. "You're too smart for me." Clara looked at him out of the corner of her eye. "Is that a compliment or a complaint?" "A compliment," Henry answered seriously. "Definitely a compliment." Clara smiled, and they continued up the trail side by side. Henry noticed she already knew the way by heart. She didn't hesitate at the stones anymore, didn't get as tired. She was getting used to it, getting stronger, becoming a woman of the ridge for real. It was in the third week that the first moment of real intimacy happened between them. Henry was fixing the roof, which had some loose shingles, working under the strong midday sun. Clara was inside the house sewing, but when she looked out the window and saw him on the roof, she got worried. She went out and called, "Henry, come down from there. The sun is too hot. You're going to get sick." Henry looked down at Clara, her hand shading her eyes, her face worried, and felt something stir in his chest. "I'm almost finished," he shouted back, but Clara wouldn't have it. "Come down now. That can wait until the afternoon when the sun is weaker." Henry obeyed, surprised by her firmness. When he came down the ladder, Clara had already brought fresh water from the spring and a wet cloth. "Sit there," she ordered, pointing to the bench in the shade. Henry obeyed again, and Clara wiped the wet cloth over his face and neck, cleaning away the sweat and dust. Her touch was gentle but firm, and Henry sat very still, aware of her hands on his skin, the scent of soap and rosemary she exhaled, the closeness of their bodies. "You need to take better care of yourself," Clara said softly. "It's no use working like a madman and then getting sick." Henry looked at her, at those dark eyes so close to his, and said in a husky voice, "It's been a long time since anyone cared for me like that." Clara stopped wiping with the cloth and looked at him. "Well, you have someone who cares now," she said finally. "Get used to it." The moment stretched out, charged with something new, something neither of them quite knew how to name yet. Finally, Clara stepped back, put the cloth away, and went back inside. Henry stayed sitting on the bench, his heart beating faster than usual, understanding that something had changed between them. They weren't just strangers sharing a house anymore. They were becoming something else, something deeper. That night, when they went to bed, the distance between them was smaller. Not by much, but enough for Henry to feel Clara's warmth closer. He fell asleep with a smile on his face. The fourth week brought the first serious storm since Clara had climbed up. The wind began to blow hard on Thursday afternoon. Black clouds gathered over the mountains, and before the sun set, the rain arrived with a fury. It wasn't a common rain, it was a true gale, with lightning tearing through the sky, thunder that made the house shake, and wind that ripped away anything not well secured. Henry closed the shutters, tied down what he could outside, and brought the chickens into the pantry. Clara helped, but he noticed she was tense, her eyes wide every time thunder cracked too close. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked. Clara admitted she was, that she always had been. When she was a child, she would hide under the bed until it passed. Henry felt an enormous tenderness for her. "Up here the storms are stronger than down below," he warned. "The wind hits directly with nothing to hold it back. But the house is solid. It's weathered dozens of gales. It'll hold." Clara nodded, but when the storm worsened and the wind began to howl like a wild beast, she turned pale. Henry saw it and did something he hadn't done yet. He reached out his hand to her. "Come," he said. "Let's sit together until it passes." They sat on the floor of the main room, leaning against the stone wall, away from the windows. Henry held Clara's hand, feeling her tremble with every thunderclap. After an especially loud one that made the whole house vibrate, Clara pulled closer, leaning her head on his shoulder. Henry sat very still, his heart racing, and slowly, carefully, as if afraid of startling a bird, he put his arm around her shoulders. Clara nestled against him, and they stayed like that, huddled on the floor while the storm roared outside. Henry felt her hair brushing his neck, her body trembling against his, and realized it wasn't just Clara who needed that embrace. He needed it too. He needed to hold someone, to be held, to feel that he wasn't alone facing the fury of the world. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it finally passed and the silence returned, broken only by the dripping of water from the roof, Clara raised her head and looked at Henry. "Thank you," she said softly, "for holding me." Henry looked at her, at those dark eyes so close, those slightly parted lips, and almost leaned in to kiss her. But he didn't have the courage. It was too early. She might not want it. It might ruin what they were building. So he just said, "Whenever you need." But that night, when they went to bed, Clara didn't stay on her edge. She stayed in the middle, and Henry stayed in the middle too. And when they woke up in the morning, they were holding each other, their bodies intertwined in a way that had happened during sleep, without a conscious decision. Neither of them commented on it, but neither pulled away quickly either. They stayed there, lying together for a few more minutes, enjoying the shared warmth before getting up to start the day. It was in the 5th week that their life on the ridge had its first serious outside interruption. Henry had gone down alone to the market. Clara had stayed home finishing a sewing commission Mrs. Higgins had secured for her. When he returned in the late afternoon, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a man Clara didn't recognize. The man was about 35, tall, well-dressed, in fine fabric clothes and leather boots without any mending. He had a trimmed mustache, a wide-brimmed hat, and the air of someone used to being obeyed. He was climbing the trail with obvious difficulty, out of breath, but determined. Clara came out of the house when she heard the voices. Henry looked uncomfortable. "This is Mr. Vincent Thorne," he introduced, "the son of Colonel Thorne, who owns the big ranch near the village. He asked to come up and see our home." Thorne took off his hat and made an exaggerated bow. "Mrs. Miller," he said in a velvet voice, "it is a pleasure to finally meet you. I have been hearing a lot about you in the village." Clara felt a tightening in her chest. She knew that name. Vincent Thorne had asked for her hand in marriage 4 years ago, when her father was still alive and the store was still thriving. At the time, she had refused because Thorne was known for drinking too much and mistreating his workers. Her father had supported the decision, saying he'd rather see his daughter single than poorly married. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Thorne," Clara said with cool politeness. "What brings you all the way up here?" Thorne looked around, at the simple house, the rocks, the isolation. "I heard you had married Henry here, and I came to see if everything was all right. A lady like yourself living in a place so rustic." I was concerned. Henry stiffened beside Clara. She noticed and placed her hand on his arm, a small gesture but a clear one. "I am very well. Thank you for your concern. My husband takes very good care of me." Thorne smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure he does. But Clara, don't you think you deserve something better? A comfortable house in town, servants, a social life. You were always a refined woman, accustomed to civilization." Henry was about to respond, but Clara squeezed his arm, asking for silence. She took a step forward and faced Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, I chose to be here. No one forced me, no one tricked me. I saw this place, I climbed this trail, I met this man, and I decided this was where I wanted to be. If that seems strange to you, I'm sorry, but I don't need your understanding or your approval." Thorne turned serious. "You may be saying that now, but wait until winter arrives. Wait until you get sick without a doctor nearby. Wait until the loneliness truly bites. When that happens, know that my offer still stands. I can give you the life you deserve." Clara felt a surge of anger. "I have the life I deserve, Mr. Thorne, and it's right here on this ridge with my husband. I appreciate the visit, but I think it's best you head back down before it gets dark. The trail is dangerous at night." Thorne put his hat back on, made another ironic bow, and began to descend. Henry and Clara stood watching him leave. When he disappeared around the bend of the trail, Henry turned to Clara. "You knew him?" Clara told him about the marriage proposal years ago, about refusing it, and about Thorne's reputation. Henry listened to it all in silence. When she finished, he asked softly, "Do you regret it? Choosing me over someone like him?" Clara looked at Henry, at that honest face, those calloused hands, those eyes looking at her with the fear of losing something precious. "No," she answered firmly. "Not for a single second. Thorne might have a big house and money, but you have something he will never have: decency." Henry felt his chest tighten with emotion. He pulled Clara to him in a sudden movement and hugged her tight. Clara hugged him back, her arms around his waist, her face against his chest. They stayed like that, embracing on the porch, as the sun set behind the mountains and the wind blew softly. That night marked a definitive change between them. When they went to bed, there was no hesitation. They lay together, their bodies close, and for the first time since they had married, Henry kissed Clara. It was a hesitant kiss at first, lips touching with care, but when Clara responded, the kiss grew deeper, more urgent, charged with weeks of accumulated tension. They pulled apart, out of breath. Henry leaned his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he whispered. "It wasn't part of the plan, but it's happening." Clara smiled in the dark. "Who said it wasn't part of the plan?" she whispered back. "I'm falling in love with you too, Henry. Since that day you wiped my face with the wet cloth, maybe even before." Henry laughed softly. "That was when you took care of me in the sun. That's when I realized. That night, the marriage of convenience turned into something real. They became husband and wife in the full sense, not just on paper but in body and soul. And when the dawn arrived, painting the sky pink and gold, they woke up intertwined, happy in a way neither of them had imagined possible. The following weeks were a period of almost unreal happiness. They worked together by day, ate together, laughed together, and by night loved each other with the intensity of those who had discovered a treasure they didn't know they were looking for. The house on the ridge stopped being an isolated place and became a refuge where the world couldn't reach them. But reality never leaves anyone in peace forever. In the 10th week since the wedding, Clara began to feel nauseous in the morning. At first, she thought she'd eaten something bad, but when the nausea persisted for a week, she knew. She told Henry one night after dinner, her voice trembling with nervousness. Henry was silent for a long moment. Then he took her hands in his. "A baby," he said, as if testing the words. "We're going to have a baby." Clara confirmed it. "I'm scared, Henry. Out here so far from everything. What if something goes wrong? What if I need a doctor?" Henry squeezed her hands. "We'll go down to the village when the time gets close. We can stay at Mrs. Higgins's house. She's already offered help if we need it. And until then, I'll take care of you. You won't want for anything." Clara took a deep breath and agreed. Henry hugged her and they stayed like that, two bodies embracing on top of the ridge with a new life beginning between them, frightened but together. Winter arrived in full force in June. The cold at the top of the ridge was intense. The wind cut like a knife, and the frost whitened everything in the morning. But Henry had prepared the house. He sealed the cracks in the windows, stacked enough firewood for 3 months, and harvested everything he could before the first hard frost. Clara was 3 months pregnant, her belly still small but noticeable, and she spent the days sewing baby clothes and patchwork blankets while Henry worked. It was on a July afternoon, with thick fog covering the valley and turning the ridge into an island suspended in the clouds, that Vincent Thorne returned. This time he didn't ask permission. He simply climbed up and knocked on the door. Henry was out checking on the chickens. Clara was alone in the house. When she opened the door and saw Thorne standing there, she felt an instinctive fear. "Mr. Thorne," she said, keeping her voice firm. "My husband isn't here at the moment." Thorne walked in without being invited. "I know. I waited for him to leave. I came to speak to you specifically." Clara didn't like his tone. "We have nothing to talk about." Thorne looked around, noticing the baby clothes on the table. "So the rumors are true. You're expecting a child." Clara instinctively crossed her arms over her belly. "That's none of your business." Thorne took a step forward. "Clara, you're making a mistake you'll pay dearly for. Raising a child in this place, far from doctors' help or civilization? What if something happens during the birth? What if the baby is born sick? Are you going to let your child die out of pride?" Clara felt the words strike deep because they echoed her own fears, but she didn't let it show. "My child will be born well and grow up strong, and they will grow up in a home full of love, not a large, empty house." Thorne laughed without humor. "Love doesn't fill the belly, Clara. Love doesn't pay for a doctor. Love doesn't protect against a harsh winter." He moved closer. "I can still give you the life you deserve. A comfortable house, servants, security for your child. All you need to do is come down with me now." Clara felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. "Get out of my house," she said in a low, dangerous voice. "Get out now before I call my husband." That was when Henry appeared at the door. He had heard the last few sentences, and his expression was a contained storm. "I believe my wife asked you to leave." Thorne didn't seem intimidated. "Henry, don't take it personally. I'm just offering an alternative to a woman who clearly hasn't thought through the consequences of her choices." Henry stepped inside, and despite Thorne being taller, it was Thorne who backed away. "My wife thought very carefully about her choices, and she chose to stay with me in this place, building our life. If you can't understand that, that's your problem, not ours. Now get out of our house and don't come back. Next time, I won't be polite." Thorne looked from Henry to Clara, realized he had lost, and left, slamming the door. Henry waited to hear his footsteps descending the trail before turning to Clara. "Did he hurt you?" Clara shook her head, but she was trembling. Henry pulled her into a hug. "He's right about one thing," Clara whispered against his chest. What if something goes wrong during the birth? What if our child needs help we can't give here? Henry held her face between his hands. We're going down to the village 3 weeks before the baby is born. We'll stay at Mrs. Higgins's house, near the midwife, near the doctor if needed. I won't let anything bad happen to you or our child. I promise. Clara looked into his eyes and saw absolute truth. She agreed, hugged him back, and decided to trust. Trust in him, in them, and in the love they had built on that impossible ridge. Winter remained harsh, but they faced it together. There were nights when the wind howled so loudly they could barely sleep, mornings when the water from the spring was covered with a layer of ice, and afternoons when the fog was so thick they couldn't see 3 yards ahead. But they had each other. They had wood for the fire, stored food, and something even more precious. They had a shared purpose. They were building a family, creating a new life in a place the world had considered impossible for love and happiness. The more winter tightened its grip, the closer they became. The more the world below seemed distant and unreal, the more their small universe at the top of the ridge became complete. Clara sang while she sewed, Henry whistled while he worked, and when they sat together on the porch, shielded from the wind, watching the fog blanket the valley, they knew they had chosen rightly. They knew they had found in each other something that cannot be bought, inherited, or begged for, true belonging. Clara's pregnancy progressed through the winter and reached spring. In September, with her belly now large and the baby's movements growing stronger, Henry began preparations to head down. Mrs. Higgins had confirmed they could stay at her house for as long as needed, and the most experienced midwife in the region, Granny Miller, had already been notified. But before they left, something happened that would change everything. It was a late September morning. The sun was already warm, but the air still held the night's crispness. Henry was digging near the spring, wanting to expand the area where the water bubbled up to make access easier. Clara was inside the house, preparing the last few items they would take to the village. Henry's shovel struck something solid that wasn't a rock. He frowned, dug more carefully around it, and then saw it. It was a metal box, rusted by time but still intact. His heart quickened. He dug further, freed the box from the earth and pulled it out. It was heavy, about the size of a small trunk, with an oxidized latch that still functioned. "Clara," he called urgently, "come see this." Clara came out of the house and made her way down to him with difficulty because of her belly. When she saw the box, her eyes widened. "What is that?" "I don't know. I found it digging here." Henry tried to open the latch, but it was stuck. He grabbed a tool, forced it carefully, and finally the latch gave way. He opened the lid slowly, and they both gasped. Inside were rolled documents, some old gold coins, and a sealed letter with red wax broken by time. Henry picked up the letter with trembling hands. The ink was faded, but still legible. He read it aloud. The letter was from Uncle Silas, written years before he died. It explained that the box contained deeds to adjacent lands that he had bought decades ago, but never officially registered. Good, flat land with road access that was worth a small fortune. Silas had kept the documents there, intending to legalize them, but never did. Now, with the deeds and the right witnesses, Henry could claim the property. The gold coins were Silas's savings, enough to pay for the legal process and still have plenty left for home improvements. The letter ended by saying, "If you found this, nephew, it's because you stayed. It's because you saw value where others saw only abandonment. These lands are your reward for not giving up on our piece of heaven." Clara and Henry stood in silence, processing. Then Clara began to laugh, tears running down her face. "Your uncle left buried treasure and you didn't even know!" Henry laughed too, incredulous. He was always eccentric. "He must have found it funny to hide this here, waiting for me to dig in the right spot. But the discovery brought a dilemma. The adjacent lands were in the valley, near the road. With them, They could build a new, more accessible, more comfortable house. They could leave the ridge and live an easier life. Thorne had been right about the dangers of isolation, especially now with a baby on the way. Henry and Clara talked for hours that night. The temptation was real. A new house, an easier life, security for their child. But at the same time, that ridge had truly become their home. They had fallen in love there. They had built something precious. Leaving felt like a betrayal of what they had lived. Finally, Clara said, "What if it's not one or the other? What if it's both?" Henry didn't understand. "How do you mean?" Clara explained her plan. They could legalize the valley lands and build a simple house there to use when necessary, especially during harsh winters or when the baby was very small. But they would keep the house on the ridge as their main home, their refuge, the place that was uniquely theirs. The money from the coins was enough to build in both places, make necessary improvements, and still have a surplus. Henry looked at his wife with renewed admiration. "You are wiser than I deserve." Clara smiled. "You deserve everything good, Henry, and so do I. We deserve to have a choice, not to be forced by necessity. We can have security without losing our freedom." They agreed on the plan. But first, the baby. 3 days later, they went down to the village carrying the bare essentials. The descent was slow. Clara stopped frequently, and Henry carried everything while also holding her arm on the most difficult stretches. When they reached the foot of the ridge, Clara looked back at the top, which could barely be seen from down here, and felt a tightening in her chest. "We'll be back," she whispered, as a promise. Mrs. Higgins received them with hugs and tears. She settled Clara into the best room, prepared special food, and called Granny Miller to examine the mother-to-be. Everything was fine. The baby was in the right position and would likely be born in 2 weeks. Henry spent the following days in the village dealing with the inheritance paperwork. With the help of a lawyer Mrs. Higgins recommended, he began the legalization process. The lawyer examined the deeds, confirmed they were legitimate, and said it would take a few months, but that Henry's right was guaranteed. The gold coins were appraised and were worth more than expected, enough not only for their plans, but to provide comfort for years. The news spread through the village. Henry, the poor man from the ridge, had inherited valuable land and gold. The same people who had mocked him now greeted him in the street. The same women who had refused to climb now made comments about having rejected him too quickly. Vincent Thorne heard the rumors and appeared at Mrs. Higgins's house one afternoon. Clara was alone. Henry had gone to settle more paperwork. Thorne didn't enter. He stayed at the door, hat in hand, a somber expression on his face. "So it's true," he said without preamble. "You're wealthy now." Clara was sitting sewing and didn't look up. "We aren't wealthy. We have a bit more security than before, that's all." Thorne took a step inside. "Clara, I was a fool. I didn't know how to see your value when I had the chance. Now I see you're an extraordinary woman, strong, intelligent, brave. If you—" Clara interrupted him, finally looking up. "If I what, Vincent? If I leave my husband now that we have money? If I forget that you offered me help not out of kindness, but out of a desire to possess what you couldn't have?" She stood up with difficulty, her hand on her large belly. "I didn't accept your offer when I had nothing. Why do you think I would accept it now?" Thorne tried to speak, but Clara didn't let him. "Henry chose me when I had nowhere to live. He took me to his home, as humble as it was. He respected me, loved me, and gave me dignity. And I chose him, not for money or position, but because I saw in him what you will never have, true goodness. Now leave and don't come back. There is nothing for you here." Thorne stood still for a moment, finally understanding that he had lost definitively. He left without saying another word. Clara sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. When Henry arrived minutes later, she told him what had happened. He hugged her and said, You are the strongest woman I know." The days passed, and the tension grew as the moment approached. Henry barely slept. He woke at every movement Clara made, checking to see if everything was all right. Clara laughed at his worry, but was also nervous. She was a first-time mother and had natural fears. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because the end of this story will move you. Labor began in the early hours of an October morning, exactly 2 weeks after they had come down. Clara woke with a backache, woke Henry, and he ran out to call Mrs. Higgins and Granny Miller. The midwife arrived calm and experienced, taking control of the situation. The labor lasted 12 hours. Henry waited outside, pacing back and forth, praying, almost going crazy with worry at every one of Clara's cries of pain. Mrs. Higgins brought periodic news. "It's all fine. It's normal. She's strong." Finally, as the sun was setting, a baby's cry tore through the air. Henry stopped breathing. Mrs. Higgins opened the door with tears in her eyes and a huge smile. "It's a girl, Henry, a beautiful, healthy girl, and Clara is fine, tired, but fine." Henry entered the room with shaking legs. Clara was lying down, pale, sweaty, her hair stuck to her forehead, but smiling. In her arms, she held a small bundle of cloth. Henry approached slowly and looked at the tiny face of his daughter. He felt something explode in his chest, an emotion so strong he could barely breathe. "She's perfect," Clara whispered in a husky voice. "Perfect, just like her father." Henry kissed Clara's forehead, then his daughter's, tears flowing uncontrollably. They named the girl Beatrice, which means she who brings happiness, and bring it she did. Mrs. Higgins's house was filled with a new joy, a renewed hope. 2 weeks later, with Clara recovered and Beatrice nursing well, Henry said, "I want to go back home, our home on the ridge. I know it'll be hard with a baby, but I miss it there. Do you want to go back too?" Clara looked at him with glowing eyes. "I was waiting for you to say that. Yes, I want to go back. I want our daughter to grow up where we fell in love." They climbed up on a clear October morning, slowly, stopping frequently. Henry carried Beatrice in a sling Clara had sewed, the baby protected against his chest. Clara climbed easily, stronger than when she had descended. When they reached the top and saw the stone house standing solid against the blue sky, they both smiled. "We're home," said Henry. "We're home," repeated Clara. The following months were a time of adaptation. A baby on the ridge brought challenges. Henry built a safer crib. Clara developed routines for washing diapers with spring water. They learned to sleep in shifts when Beatrice cried at night. But it also brought joys. Seeing their daughter grow up in that pure air, hearing her laughter echoing among the rocks, knowing she was being raised in a special place. At the same time, Henry worked on building the house in the valley whenever he went down. It was a simple structure, 3 rooms, but well built and comfortable. It would serve for harsh winters, for emergencies, or for when they needed to stay in the village longer. But their true home remained the ridge. As the months passed, life on the ridge improved significantly. Henry used part of the money to make important improvements. He hired a skilled man to help widen some parts of the trail, making the climb less dangerous. He built a small pulley system to bring up heavy loads without having to carry them on his back. He expanded the house, adding a room for Beatrice and a larger covered work area. He installed better windows that closed properly and provided more protection from the cold. Clara expanded her sewing business. With the valley house ready, she went down once a week to take orders and deliver finished work. Her reputation as a skilled seamstress grew, and soon she had more work than she could handle. Mrs. Higgins helped by distributing the orders and collecting payments. The ridge property also prospered. Henry discovered that certain plants grew exceptionally well in that climate and altitude. rare medicinal herbs, specific vegetables, and flowers that city merchants would pay well for. He began cultivating with purpose, and soon he had a steady income from selling these specialized products. 2 years passed. Beatrice grew up healthy and strong, playing safely among the rocks like a child born to a rugged place. The house on the ridge had been transformed. It was no longer a simple, austere structure, but a welcoming home with colorful curtains, flowers in vases, and improvements that made it comfortable without losing its character. Henry and Clara had changed too. They were no longer the wounded loners who had joined out of necessity. They were true partners who had faced literal and figurative storms together and come out stronger. The love between them had matured and deepened, becoming a solid foundation upon which they built everything else. It was on a spring afternoon, 3 years after their wedding, that Henry and Clara were sitting on the porch he had expanded. Beatrice played at their feet with a rag doll her mother had made. The valley stretched out green and peaceful below. The sky was clear, and the wind blew softly. "Do you regret it?" Henry asked suddenly. "Staying, choosing this life?" Clara looked at him, surprised. "Not once," she replied without hesitation. "Not when it was hard, not when I was scared. This life is our own creation. It wasn't given. It was earned. Every stone in this house, every plant in this garden, every improvement we made, all of it is truly ours. How could I regret it?" Henry took her hand and intertwined their fingers. "I don't regret it either. I don't regret even the rejections I went through before you, because they led me to you." Clara smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Remember the first time I climbed up? I was so nervous. I didn't know if I'd make it. I didn't know if you'd be good to me. I didn't know if this place would accept me. And now I know this ridge is mine as much as it is yours. It's where I belong. It's where our love grew." She paused. "You know what's funny? The other women who refused, they saw difficulty and danger. I saw that too. But I saw something else. I saw a possibility. I saw a man who was offering not just what he had, but everything he had. And that made all the difference." Henry kissed her head. "You saved me from loneliness. You gave me a family. You gave me purpose. You saved me from the humiliation of living on someone's charity. You gave me a home. You gave me love." Clara turned to look into his eyes. "We saved each other, Henry. It was equal. It was right." They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the sunset begin to paint the sky. Beatrice had fallen asleep, leaning against her mother's legs, tired from playing. The peace was deep and complete. "You know what I'm thinking?" Clara said after a while. "I'm thinking the people in the village must think we're lucky, because of the inheritance, the gold, the land." Henry agreed. "They do think that. They talk about it." Clara laughed softly. "But the truth is, luck was the smallest part of it. Luck gave us some money and land. But we were the ones who built the rest. We were the ones who climbed this mountain every day. We were the ones who faced the winter. We were the ones who chose to stay when we could have walked away." "That's true," Henry agreed. "The inheritance helped, but it didn't change the essential things. Even without it, we would have been happy here, maybe with more struggle, but happy." Clara nodded. "Because happiness wasn't in the buried gold. It was in waking up beside each other, in working together, in looking at this impossible view and knowing it's ours, in raising our daughter in a place we chose, out of love, not convenience." The sun was setting in spectacular tones of red and orange. Henry looked at that view he had seen 1,000 times, and that never failed to move him. Then he looked at Clara, at her profile against the golden light, and felt a gratitude so intense it almost hurt. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you more with every day that passes." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining. "I love you too." I love you for the man you are. I love this place because it's yours. I love the life we built because it's ours." And they kissed while the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Beatrice sleeping peacefully at their feet and the wind singing softly through the rocks. And in that moment, at the top of that ridge, everyone had refused. Everyone had thought impossible for happiness and love. Henry and Clara knew the truth. They had found not just each other, but they had found home. The years went on. The story of Henry and Clara became a legend in the village of Stone Creek. People told outsiders about the man who lived in the impossible place and the brave woman who stayed when all the others refused. They told of the love that grew in isolation and of the family that prospered where no one thought it possible. Vincent Thorne eventually married a wealthy rancher's daughter, a marriage of convenience that left both of them unhappy. Whenever he saw Clara in the village, he looked away, ashamed. Clara didn't feel anger toward him, only pity. He had had a chance to choose love over convenience, and had chosen wrong. Mrs. Higgins became an honorary grandmother to Beatrice, visiting whenever she could, though the climb grew harder for her as the years passed. She'd laugh and say she'd made her best match, that Henry and Clara were proof that sometimes the improbable is exactly right. The improvements to the trail allowed more people to visit the ridge, true friends, not malicious gawkers. And everyone who climbed up and saw the house, the garden, the view, and the happy family left transformed. They understood that home isn't about luxury or ease. It's about belonging. It's about choice. It's about love that endures when tested. Henry continued cultivating his special plants. Clara continued sewing, and together they created a life that was simple but rich, hard but rewarding. Yes, winter was still harsh up there. Yes, the trek up and down was still tiring. Yes, there were days they thought about how much easier it would be to just live in the valley house. But they always returned to the ridge, because that was where they had fallen in love. That was where they had built something from nothing. That was where they woke up with the world at their feet and the sky so close they felt they could touch it. That was home. On a winter night, 5 years after the wedding, Henry was lying with Clara in his arms, listening to the wind outside and the sounds of Beatrice sleeping in the next room. He thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the 5 women who had refused to climb. He thought about how rejected and humiliated he had felt, destined for solitude. And then he thought of Clara appearing that day, climbing the trail with determination, looking at the impossible place and seeing possibility. He thought about how a single person who sees your value can change everything. How true love doesn't need a perfect setting, only willing hearts. "Are you awake?" he whispered in the dark. "I am," Clara replied. "Why?" Henry hugged her tighter. "I just wanted to say thank you for staying, for seeing me, for turning my prison into paradise." Clara turned in his arms to face him even in the dark. "Henry, you never understood, did you? I didn't turn anything into anything. Paradise was always here. I just needed to have eyes to see it." She touched his face with tenderness. The other women looked and saw a humble house, a dangerous trail, isolation. I looked and saw an honest man, fertile land, freedom. The difference wasn't in what you offered. It was in how I looked at it. Henry felt her words sink in deep. "Do you think we would have been happy anywhere?" he asked. "Or is this specific place part of who we are?" Clara thought before answering. "I think we would have been happy anywhere because we have each other. But this place is special. This place tested us, and we saw we were strong. This place isolated us from the world, and we learned we were enough for each other. This place is a symbol of what we built. Difficult, improbable, but true." Henry kissed her slowly, savoring the moment. Then he whispered, "I'm the luckiest man in the world." Clara laughed softly. "It's not luck, my love. It's a choice. You chose me, I chose you, and we keep choosing each other every day. That's not luck. That's work. That's commitment, that's love. And they stayed embraced in the dark, atop the ridge that defied storms and isolation, knowing they had found something few find in life: true partnership, tested love, and a hard-won home. The years continued to advance. Beatrice grew up strong and healthy, helping her parents from a young age, learning to love that impossible place as much as they did. The house on the ridge went through more improvements: a small storage addition, a better chicken coop, and a small barn. But it kept its character, it kept its soul. Henry and Clara grew old together, their hair gaining strands of white, their hands growing more calloused, but their love growing deeper. The day came when they climbed the trail more slowly, stopping more often, but they kept climbing, because that was home, because that was where they belonged. And when they sat on the porch at the end of the day, looking at the valley below and reminiscing, they always returned to the same story: the day he needed a humble wife, and all refused upon seeing the house, but one stayed. And that one changed everything. It wasn't the buried gold that saved them. It wasn't the inherited land that brought happiness. It was Clara's courage to climb when all the others went down. It was Henry's honesty in offering the truth instead of a pretty lie. It was the love that grew slow but steady between two wounded people who found healing in each other. The true wealth, they discovered, was never measured in gold coins or acres of land. It was measured in mornings waking up together, in afternoons working side by side, and in nights sharing dreams and fears. It was measured in looks that made words unnecessary, in touches that healed invisible wounds, and in silences that were more eloquent than any speech. The ridge that everyone thought impossible for love revealed its final secret: the hardest places to reach are exactly where the strongest love grows, because easy love is not tested. Convenient love is not proven, but love that chooses to climb a mountain, face a storm, and persist when it would be easier to give up, that love is unbreakable. And so Henry and Clara lived, not happily ever after in the sense of a fairy tale where everything is perfect, but truly happy, with real difficulties overcome by real love. Happy with a life built with their own hands, a home won with courage, and a family raised with dedication. And when the grandchildren came years later and asked how their grandparents met, Clara always told the whole story. About the honest man who lived in the impossible place, about the women who refused because they saw only difficulty, about the woman who accepted because she saw possibility, and about how true love doesn't need a perfect setting, only hearts ready to build together. The grandchildren listened, fascinated, looking around at the house on the ridge that had been the stage for such a beautiful love. And they understood that the place wasn't special on its own. It was special because it had been chosen, loved, and conquered. It was special because there, at the top of that piece of heaven suspended between rocks, two lonely souls had found each other and decided that together they could turn the impossible into home. And that truth, simple but profound, was the true treasure Henry and Clara would leave for the world: that a humble house shared with true love is worth more than 100 mansions inhabited by loneliness, that it's worth more to climb a mountain beside someone who loves you than to walk on flat ground beside someone who ignores you, that it's worth more to choose the hard way together than to accept the easy way alone. As the sun set over the ridge, painting everything in gold, and Henry held Clara's hand as he had held it 1,000 times before, they both knew the final truth. They hadn't chosen an easy life. They had chosen a real life, and that, in the end, made all the difference. The ridge would remain there for generations, a silent witness to a love that refused ease and chose authenticity. And anyone who climbed that trail, looked at that view, and felt that wind would understand. That was a sacred place, not by being religious, but for having sheltered something rare and precious. Two people who chose each other not for convenience, but for truth. Not despite the difficulties, but through them. And that was the perfect ending. Not because everything was easy, but because everything was real. Not because there was no pain, but because the pain was overcome together. Not because the place was perfect, but because the love was true. And so, atop the ridge where no one wanted to stay, Henry and Clara built something everyone wanted to have. A true home, true love, and true happiness. Earned stone by stone, day by day, choice by choice. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.